The 1920s and 1930s were a time of cookie-cutter type housing, with the new neighborhoods being built throughout the country, and it seemed as if every neighborhood had the name along the lines of Sunset Paradise or Spring Gardens. Most of the neighborhoods had residents that kept their lawns looking good and streets clean. But as more and more neighborhoods close to bigger cities became the destination of more and more people, many of the original residents of the perfect neighborhoods were driven out as many low-income families took their spots, and soon those same, once prized neighborhoods were now homes of minority families that tended to overcrowd the living space, and overall, the neighborhoods began to turn to blight. As a result, the Housing Act of 1937 was created by the U.S. government to assist states and political subdivisions of states to remedy the unsafe housing conditions and acute shortage of decent and safe dwellings for low-income families. Also to assist states and political subdivisions of states to address the shortage of housing affordable to low-income families. Although this helped in some way in the communities, it was obviously not the long-term solution to fix the problem of neighborhoods turning into slums. President Truman elaborated on the issue in his 1949 State of the Union address. 5 million families are living in slums and fire traps. 3 million families share their homes with others. This after about 12 years of the Housing Act of 1937 being in place. Consequently, the Housing Act of 1949 was created, which became known as the Kickstart to Urban Renewal of American Cities. The government knew a drastic change was needed, and a massive makeover of housing in communities was the only answer, in a sense to clean out the blighted housing and to rebuild it. But there were many consequences of doing so. This new Housing Act of 1949 increased authorization for the Federal Housing Administration mortgage insurance, also extending federal money to build more than 800,000 public housing units, and permitted the FHA to provide financing for rural homeowners. From here on out, this was the guidelines of which planners lived by. Basically, get the necessary funds, point out which neighborhood should be tagged for slum clearance, bulldoze the designated area, and rebuild the lots all over again. Although this might sound simple, the city planners, as we soon will find out, did not take into consideration the many issues that the displaced people faced when it came to class and racial struggles when trying to put those people back into the renewed housing. A classic example of this process can be seen in a neighborhood of downtown Cincinnati's West End called Laurel Homes, which still exists today. Every major city in America is home to thousands of people that surely intend to live in areas that are clean and look presentable. The city of Cincinnati is no different. Although no one intends to have their neighborhood begin to look low-class with trash littering the streets or structural damage occurring on homes or apartment complexes, it is often difficult to avoid. Whether it is someone's grass in his or her front yard or the paint on their house, things in life need constant maintenance, and the same goes for a city's public housing. Many factors go into the renewal of particular sections of a city that may ultimately lead to the renewal of an entire city. Throughout the 1930s, the neighborhoods that were once spacious and peaceful more than 20 years earlier were now beginning to get noticed for their gritty appearance and economic downfall. Beginning in 1948, Cincinnati city officials could not bear to look at the untidiness. As a result, the first official plans began to take shape in order to fix the blighted areas that were scattered throughout the West End near the Mill Creek Expressway, in order to make change to the city's public housing. The city officials at the office of the city manager spent the early to middle 1940s in discussion to figure out the plans for the renewal of particular neighborhoods that were experiencing cases of blight. The planning phase was time-consuming in the sense that they had to work to discover and identify the blighted public housing, and once they found the neighborhoods that were qualified, they had to outline the area to specifically point out which buildings needed to be included in the plan. The Ohio Redevelopment Act defined a blighted area as an area within the corporate limits of a city in which a majority of the structures is detrimental to public health, safety, or welfare by reason of age, disrepair, overcrowding, faulty arrangement, lack of ventilation, or any combination of these factors. The majority of these areas were located in the West End. Consequently, Cincinnati adopted the Metropolitan Master Plan in 1948, which included a recommendation to construct the Mill Creek Expressway through the West End. This new plan was set to cost roughly $375,000, and 18 different volumes were published to cover every phase of community life. Main aspects of the plan involved recognizing the bad public housing that was the result of rapid growth. In order to fix the residential area's issues, the plan included 4 steps to help the surrounding neighborhoods: protection, conservation, rehabilitation, and redevelopment. The plan was set to cover 56,390 units in 54 different project areas over a 15-year period to eliminate blight and inferior living. An area that was chosen for immediate renewal was the neighborhood of Laurel Homes, that was designated as the title LA3 as its project area name. In the same area, the Mill Creek Expressway was going to be constructed, along with the connecting Wright-Laughlin Highway that measured 10 miles in length with 8 interchanges. The expressway contributed to the plans that was set for Laurel. Altogether, the plans to redevelop Laurel covered 29.41 acres. On May 21, 1951, the Planning Commission approved the initial 10 projects of the West End area neighborhoods. Laurel and Richmond were the only two that were approved for immediate action toward redevelopment. Many of the West End neighborhoods had similar public spaces and were set for renewal also. Laurel, for example, had 91.6% of the buildings that were residential, and therefore most of the plans catered to the people. Out of 356 residential buildings, there were 111 buildings that had multiple families staying in one living quarters, contributing to overcrowding in and around Laurel. There were many detailed areas of focus, but some of the most important were expansion of elementary schools, widening and realigning of Lynn Street on the west end for the expressway, and the hospital and shopping center additions along Lincoln Park Drive. The funding aspect of this redevelopment is most important when it comes to making sure the project will include everything in the proposed plans. The federal government provides 2/3 of the net project losses in the form of a capital grant, which covered most of the cost. The other third falls on the shoulders of Cincinnati, where they can pay in cash or sponsor donations of land or site improvements at the cost of public facilities that directly benefited the project area. Many sites are purchased and funded by private investors and companies, but some sites with complete clearance cost more. These funds were to come from long-term financial commitments to the federal government through capital bond programs, and after doing so, city officials made a visual map of where and what the new additions will look like. After all the plans and funding was completed and drawings for the new projects were approved, the implementation phase begun. As stated earlier, the main cause for Cincinnati's urban renewal of the West End neighborhoods was the fact that there was far too much blight. Consequently, this gave not only a bad reputation to the area, but it hurt the city economically, where profits decreased because of the lack of mid to upper classes being attracted to the area to spend their money. Improvements in public housing and all other facilities was considered the solution to the problem. Most of the projects had full bulldozed destruction of the whole lot, and most people in the West End had a positive view on the renewal because it had a lot to do with the additions of structures to benefit the residents, but eventually there were many people who could not afford to live in Laurel and moved away. You would think that most of the residents were outraged, right? It is safe to say that that was their initial reactions, but city officials promised the displaced families new housing. Cincinnati was one of the first cities in America to establish a relocation agency with the responsibility of finding decent, safe, and sanitary homes for all families displaced by any city action. This agency published a family relocation document in 1952, along with another publication called Characteristics of Occupants of Laurel 3, which both surveyed and described the needs of families of the area in order to help them relocate. As destruction began and workers began to clean up the blighted areas throughout the West End, most families cooperated after being given the documents that described the promised relocation. But some families refused to cooperate, which delayed the process for those specific buildings. Eventually, the city officials would offer them money for their property, and with time, the families were moved. However, those that refused altogether were forced to leave by police, which was a rare occurrence in the West End because of the city's promise and how the concern for the family's relocation was strong. Most people appreciated that, and in all cases where families were displaced, their living conditions improved. There were a total of 12,588 families who were displaced in a 5-year span as a result from the housing improvements. In an interview with former resident of Cincinnati, Ronald J. Janowczyk, many similar events were touched upon even though he was a resident between 1970 and 1972. He went on to say, "I remember driving through the narrow streets surrounded by bad housing projects like in Chicago. A lot of the time I saw prisoners cleaning up the roads and picking up trash. More housing then started to be torn down, old homes too, and they built up high-rises, which I feel added to the crime." Along with many of the developments that improved schools and hospitals, the Cincinnati Reds baseball team was a topic of discussion as well during Janowczyk's stay in Cincinnati. Before moving downtown to Cincinnati, Janowczyk did electrical work in the late 1960s at the time of the new Reds stadium that was being built. He said, "I remember being there and seeing them tear down old Crosley Field, and right after that they started building the new Reds stadium.